When the Roman standards rose above the city walls, the screams had already begun. Long before the iron gates were smashed open, the women of the conquered city knew what victory meant, not for Rome, but for them. They had heard the stories whispered by refugees, traders, and defeated soldiers who limped across borders carrying terror instead of goods. Roman victory was praised in marble and poetry, but for the conquered, it arrived soaked in ash, blood, and silence. At dawn, the city still stood. By nightfall, it would belong to Rome. The Roman legions marched with terrifying discipline. Their armor gleamed, their banners fluttered like crimson warnings, and their footsteps struck the ground in perfect rhythm. To the Senate, this was glory. To generals, it was triumph. But behind shuttered windows, women pressed their children close and prayed to gods who had already turned away. When the walls fell, chaos followed. Roman soldiers poured through the breaches like a flood. Men who resisted were cut down quickly, sometimes mercifully, sometimes not. The old, the sick, and those who could not flee were crushed beneath boots or blades. Fire spread from house to house as soldiers searched for valuables, food, and captives. The city's screams blended with the crackling of burning roofs. For women, survival did not mean safety. Roman custom treated conquered people as spoils of war. This was not hidden or denied, it was law, tradition, and expectation. A defeated city belonged to the victor, and so did the lives inside it. Gold, land, livestock, and human beings were counted and claimed with equal coldness. Young women were dragged from their homes, their names replaced by numbers in a ledger. Noblewomen who once walked in silk were stripped of their status in moments. Mothers were torn from children. Sisters were separated forever. No distinction was made between the innocent and the accused. Conquest erased all former identities. Some women were marched immediately behind the legions, bound with rope, barefoot on broken roads. Others were held temporarily in makeshift camps, guarded day and night. Food was scarce. Water was rationed. Fear became constant. The worst part was not knowing. Would they be sold? Enslaved? Given to soldiers as rewards? Sent to Rome as trophies in a triumphal parade? Every rumor was worse than the last, and each sunrise brought fewer answers. Roman soldiers joked openly about their future possessions. Officers inspected captives as one might inspect horses, checking age, strength, and obedience. Resistance was punished swiftly. Tears were ignored. Pleas were mocked. To Rome, this was order. To the women, it was the end of the world they had known. Days later, the surviving captives were assembled outside the ruined city. Smoke still rose behind them, carrying the smell of everything they had lost. Roman scribes recorded names only to erase them. From that moment forward, these women were no longer daughters, wives, or citizens. They were property. Some were chosen immediately by commanders or wealthy patrons. Others were chained in groups and sent to slave markets across the empire, Gaul, Hispania, Africa, and Rome itself. The journey alone killed many. Those who collapsed were left by the road, their bodies unmarked and unmourned. Among the captives was a woman named Livia, not Roman, but now trapped in Rome's shadow. She had been a potter's daughter, her hands once stained with clay. Now they were bound, swollen, and bleeding. She watched as her mother was pulled in another direction, screaming her name until a soldier struck her silent. Livia never saw her again. As the column moved, Livia realized a terrible truth: the conquest was not finished when the battle ended. For women, it was only beginning. Rome would celebrate this victory with statues and speeches. Poets would write of bravery and destiny. Generals would be crowned with laurel wreaths. But none would speak of the women who vanished into chains, whose lives were shattered quietly, far from the marble halls of history. And the world would call it civilization. The Roman slave markets did not smell like blood. They smelled like sweat, dust, and money. Captured women were displayed beneath awnings to shield buyers from the sun, not to shield the captives from shame. Traders called out prices, boasting of youth, strength, or beauty. Teeth were inspected. Hands were examined. Bodies were evaluated like tools meant to last a lifetime. Livia stood among them, hollow-eyed. By Roman law, enslaved women had no legal protection. What happened to them was considered a private matter, not a crime. Some were purchased by households, where their fate depended entirely on the temperament of their owners. A kind master meant survival. A cruel one meant suffering without witness. Others were sent to farms, workshops, or mines, places where exhaustion broke the spirit long before the body failed. A few were forced into public institutions, where dignity disappeared entirely. Death was common. Escape was rare. For noble captives, the fall was often crueler. Women who once commanded respect were paraded in Roman triumphs, forced to walk behind victorious generals while crowds cheered. They were living symbols of Rome's dominance, reminders that even royalty could be reduced to nothing. Some were later executed quietly to prevent rebellion. Others were married off as political tools or confined for life. Motherhood offered no protection. Children born to enslaved women inherited their mother's status. They were slaves from birth, belonging not to their parents but to the household. Many mothers watched their children sold away, powerless to stop it. Rome expanded not only through conquest, but through generations born in bondage. Yet even in this darkness, the women endured. They whispered stories at night to remember who they had been. They taught their children old songs, old gods, old names, even when punishment followed. Memory became resistance. Survival became defiance. Livia was sold to a merchant's household. She learned Latin slowly, painfully. Years passed. The scars faded, but the loss never did. She watched Rome prosper from the labor of the conquered and wondered how history would remember them. It would not. Roman writers praised order, law, and progress. They called themselves the bringers of civilization. And in many ways, they were. Roads, aqueducts, and laws shaped the world for centuries. But those stones were laid on silent suffering. The women captured after Roman victories left no monuments. No statues bore their names. No triumphs honored their endurance. Their stories survived only in fragments, in graffiti, in letters, in the spaces between official histories. Rome fell eventually, as all empires do. But the pain it inflicted lived on, carried through bloodlines and memory. The captured women were not just victims of war, they were erased from the story of power, even though they paid its highest price. History remembers Rome as great. But if we listen closely, past the speeches, past the marble, we can still hear the voices of the women who paid for that greatness with their lives. And their silence is the most horrifying legacy of all.